Howdy of you delicious people. I'm here today to review Hulk 2003. So I'm here today to review this movie that when going into it and finally looking back on it, I'm like, what is this film? This film is kind of, like, I would call it very goofy looking. When you have the Hulk throughout this movie, the Hulk does not look consistent to me. It looks like there's a variety of different looking Hulks throughout this entire film. They could not get, I guess, the imagery to look consistent. It doesn't look consistent at all. Here's also the thing. We have it to where there is no real, true, seemingly villain through this movie, even though a lot of people say, oh no, the villain is absolutely so-and-so character. I would just say, doesn't exactly give a whole lot of weight. Some people could debate, it's like, well, there's multiple villains in this movie. Isn't that better? Going on into this movie, I think that there is something goofy going on with this film. Here's the thing. In one scene of this movie, we have it being bizarrely blurred out. I guess to try to keep their PG-13 rating. Yeah, go ahead and check out the Brian Banner story where he is talking about him and his wife, and then all of a sudden you get a big giant blurry scene, I guess, to keep their PG-13 rating, and then we move on to eventually have the mother who is to grab onto a nuclear blasting. It makes no sense. I'm gonna hold out for what exactly? A interesting looking visual. Here's also the goofy thing. So every single person who has to be upset in this movie has to talk like this. I'm so angry. I'm so angry at everything. If you have it to where Bruce Banner sounds like that when he's angry, and Sam Elliott, General Ross, sounds like that too. Every person that sounds angry or upset in this film, most of them sound like this. I don't know why. We have it to where Banner has to do these things with his fingers. He's like he wants to just, I want to have a waterfall of fingers in front of me while I'm angry. I don't know what it is, because we have that motion done, I think, one or two times in this movie. We have it to where, oh God, we had there was a couple of things that I wanted to specifically mention, specifically for this film, because there were some things that I just found were just kind of goofy in the film. We have it to where there's quite a few dream sequences and stuff that I guess we are supposed to understand or try to define upon ourselves. There is also the thing that I like about this movie is that we have a kind of fractured Bruce Banner where we have his life that has been so distorted, or his upbringing was so bad that we have it to where Banner had forgotten portions of his past, or otherwise have had consistent nightmares about certain things here or there. That is probably the best thing about Banner within this movie, is just to have a kind of mentally fractured Banner. I wish that we really had like almost a like I wish that we would have had like a schizophrenic kind of Banner to where reasonably we would have this Hulk like character in Banner's head this entire time, and he doesn't really become fully fledgedly 100% unlocked, so to speak, until the gamma goes in to hit him, and then voila, that actually splits the two characters into a real, true persona. Like, have Banner have nightmares about uh, a hulkish character consistently, and then eventually, like, have it be really showcased after this whole bomb is to go off. We also seem to have Betty seemingly having her nightmares or her whatever as well within this movie, which I guess can connect the two people together, and so on and so forth. But here's also the thing: they have to try to make Banner very nerdy, and I can't believe that they try to just make Banner look very nerdy by giving him a bicycle helmet. So that's supposed to That's supposed to make him look like a nerd by putting a bike helmet on him. Yeah, that's gotta work. Yeah. Uh, Here's also the thing. So we have General Ross. When he is talking to Banner, he's like laser point into like looking to his eyes and like, "You're gonna go and work in herbal hair jail. Look at my mustache. Yeah." But every single time that General Ross in this movie is talking to Betty, we end up having it to where General Ross is like up in the clouds, like talking to her. Like every single when you watch this movie, just watch the General Ross and Betty Ross scenes where we have it to where Betty is talking to Ross, and the we have like Ross who is talking to the ceiling the entire time, like doing this whole line of dialogue, talking about him being so upset with Talbot, but he's like talking to nobody, and when we have it to where Ross and Betty are having this like phone exchange. We have it to where I think like Ross is just like, dude, I don't want to be in anywhere close of actually talking to Betty. I just guess I feel I have to. But again, I'm gonna look way off into the left, uh, and not actually be seemingly really into this whole conversation thing that I'm having on the telly. If anything, this movie kind of feels like they were trying to have the least amount of characters being together at one time, as if that they wanted to like save some money about like kind of cutting these scenes separately from one another so that way they could save some money. uh Here's also a thing, because we have it to where Brian Banner is like calling Bruce on the phone, going like, "Ha ha ha ha! Guess what? I suck my dogs on Betty. By the way, love you, smooches, cause I'm your pop pop." could could have could have Brian Banner called Bruce on the phone and said, like, "Hey, I know you're in the hospital, but I'm just letting you know now that I'm your father. Just so you're aware." What are you talking about? You better control that temper. You better control that temper, Banner. Anyways, so God, I think there was another like goofy thing that I saw in this film, because a lot of this movie was just goofy. So also the pacing of this film was really slow. Uh, like to me, I was just like, I was watching like Hulk like take down like a helicopter, and I could have like just said like, man, like we really we really could have had Hulk really just really take down this thing, but it just feels like it's like ripped into pieces, and like yeah, it's just really like I don't know if it was just my copy of this movie, but I don't know, maybe somebody pick up the like the best copy that they can find of this film and like really see the pacing on this film and see if it is really pretty slow or not. Uh Also, when going into this movie, I think this movie was like, I swear, it was probably like 2 hours and something. And I'm like, man, there is not nearly enough Hulk in this movie. And there is also nearly not enough Hulk destruction in this film. With it being like 2 hours and change, I was like, good God. I'm like, I wanted to have seen more Hulk in this movie. And plus, two, we have it to where Hulk isn't he isn't really doing much of action when he is really being Hulk. Like I don't know how many times that he's just running off somewhere or jumping around somewhere, and I guess to try to keep the PG-13 thing. But anyways, so I think that's it. I think I covered everything that I wanted to get out of the way before we get into the cryptic like version of this. Overall, I found this movie to be bleep 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 bleep. I found this movie to be fun because I thought it was odd. It was so odd to me. I was like, man, this is a real disconnect from going from this Hulk movie, or because I watched Incredible Hulk and I'm like, man, what's still a great film. From what all I've remembered of it, because good God, my watching too many movies just blendered away. But yeah, going from Incredible Hulk to this movie is a huge disconnect. Where it's just like, holy crap! I'm like, it's like night and day. You have an amazing film called The Incredible Hulk, where they have like all the technical sides, and they really go into like Banner trying to figure out how to cure the whole Hulk thing and all kinds of things, and like him really doing the science of it, where like this Banner is just like, hey, like, you know what? I feel like when I'm the Hulk, I feel like it's like uh being birthed. It's like boom, boom, boom. Like, a lot of the way that like these lines are delivered and they're like carried out, like when watching it I was like, this is so weird, like how anybody would have to like slow down this dialogue. Like it kind of feels like some of this dialogue is like being delivered as if like they're trying to be quiet for the movie that's being filmed next door. Like that's what it feels like this movie is trying to be, and I just found it to be odd. So with that said, I'm gonna try to get out of the cryptic like sense and get into the spoilers. So let's go out of our way to say that we've seen this film and let's talk about it. If anything, people cannot find a convenient way to find this film. More than likely, this film might be in some it says it's on Hulu, but it's probably going to be on some like Showtime or Stars or some inconvenient app for you to download and maybe have a XYZ free trial of it. I would suggest going on to an app called Movie Pro or any number of other just kind of movie apps and just kind of like do the pull of jackpotting and seeing if you can find this movie and watch it and just be like, yeah, this is an odd film. But at the end of the day, I think it's time to say, let's get into that spoiler time. Because reasonably, the villains. My biggest complaint about this film is the opposite end of the spectrum, the villain side of this. Like, man, like, this movie kind of villain wise kind of like reminds me of Unbreakable, because the villain is technically unexistent in that movie, and so it kind of feels like that in this. And eventually I should review Unbreakable. So eventually, if that happens, then you'll know where that came from. Definitely from this movie. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So we have to show the entire lifespan of a man named Banner to justify that Bruce is to have not exactly had the gamma exposure making him the Hulk. It was something built up for so many years, and then the gamma exposure was a thing that just got the ball rolling to finally say, okay, you're going to turn into a big, huge rage monster, so go have fun with that. So we end up having Banner, who is a young kid who is given toys by his father, and so then we have it to where Brian Banner is playing rough with these toys, and so we end up having it to where Brian Banner is to give his son injections, seemingly for a long periods of time, and so. And I'm gonna try as much as possible to just like perfectly timeline it in this film to where this film kind of jumps around with the previous or the early stages of Banner, where I think I'm just gonna go right and snowplow through all of that and just get to the nitty gritty parts of importancy. So we have Banner, who had gotten into a fight with some kid in school, but it seems that he did not actually fight the kid. He just stood there just shaking. And so we evidently had the other kid eventually just back down. And so that is an interesting part within this movie to just kind of, I guess, show us that Banner is a person that is trying to stall becoming the Hulk, I guess, at a young age, because he doesn't have that gamma yet. So, moving on. So, we are to have a memory that Banner is completely and utterly had forgotten about, and so now I'm going to bring that up right now instead of bringing it up later. So, we end up finding out that it seems that Brian Banner had been found out by his government that he had been testing something on Bruce. And so we end up having Brian Banner confessing to his wife that, like, hey, like, they're coming for our son. Like, they found out that I've been testing this stuff on him. And so, like, now I think that I need to kill our son, because reasonably the government is going to take him away. And so we end up having seemingly both Brian and Edith tussling over this knife, and we end up having Brian stabbing Edith. So here's the goofy part of a blur, bizarrely. And then eventually we have it to where Edith is like, oh no, I'm covering up the wound that I don't have. And so Edith ends up dragging her body outside of her home, where there is absolutely nothing in her backyard, And so we have Edith, who is bizarrely reaching out to seemingly nothing, nowhere. But then seconds later, we end up having this gigantic bomb that is horizon, which is to foreshadow what is to end up uh, to Brian at the end of this movie. So we have Edith bizarrely reaching out to this bomb, which I thought was like, well, I guess that's a cool visual, but that's just odd. Like, why did she drag? Like, I guess she was like, dude, I'm dying, so I guess I'm just gonna reach out to anything and hope that anyone is going to try to save me, I guess, out of all of this. So we have it to where Banner had completely blocked out that memory until Ross had brought it up to him, which I will bring up, I guess, later. So we have it to where Banner had gone off to adopt an adopted family, where his actual name is Bruce Krensler or something along those lines. And so we have Banner, who is to have nightmares, and his adopted mother is to go and uh, is to kind of comfort him and stuff when he has to wake up with bad memories and bad dreams and so on and so forth. So I think we eventually have Betty, who ends up taking Bruce back to this home of which that he had lived in, to where they are to eventually have Banner finally have these memories, to where he's relived it and he realizes now like why exactly Ross was talking about, like, how is it that you don't remember this, blah 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 blah. So we have Bruce, who is a much older individual, coming to work with his goofy looking bike helmet because that makes him so nerdy. And so we end up having Banner going into his science lab. And so here's the thing. So we end up having us find out that it seems that Bruce and Betty's relationship is to be broken up. It seems like they have differences that will have them just keep fighting with one another. So we end up in this scenario having some Harper guy that is to tell Bruce, it's like, well, hey, like, did she dump you because of your bike helmet? And Bruce is like, no. So we end up having Bruce and Betty having this talk before they do their test trial experiment and thing. And so we end up having Betty just coming up with this kind of debate between the two of them, to where Betty is just wanting to desperately try to just kind of fling something into Bruce's face, where it's like, yeah, this is the reason why you and I broke up, is because of your stubbornness and your unwillingness to do whatever and what have you. And so Bruce is just like, you know what? Like, I get it. I get that you don't like me. Like, you know what? Like, we should be expecting this when we are to have to forcibly work together, that eventually all of this like relationship stuff is going to mix in with our work stuff. It's bound to happen. So, like, that's okay that you're going to say this stuff to me, because I knew it was going to happen anyways. So we have Bruce and we have Betty doing their experiment, and so they test this experiment on frogs, and what ends up happening is they end up blowing the frog up. And so Betty is like, oh my god, this experiment went horribly awry. So, but hey, I guess if we ever get a plague or thousands upon thousands of frogs just start dropping out of the sky, then hey, like we got that whole frog situation covered, so we can just blow them all up. So we also end up finding out that it seems that Talbot is sniffing around Betty, trying to ask certain questions about either her or about Bruce, trying to like sniff around to see uh, like how far are they with their experiments, and trying to see if Talbot is trying to see if they have any interest in like working with him, to where Betty, of course, is completely uninterested. But we end up having Talbot, who ends up seeing that they are going on their second run of this experiment. So Talbot ends up making his way to Bruce's facility, and we end up having Bruce saying, like, well, like, hey, like, it's nice to meet you, but, like, you know what? I don't want to know any little bit of you, because I have no interest in being in any part of your experiments, or I have no interest in being in any part of your company whatsoever. Because Talbot asks, it's like, well, hey, like, would you like to just join my company? And of course, Bruce Banner ends up saying no. It's like, well, Talbot's like, well, you know what? I just asked you nicely. Like, there's kind of a difference between asking nicely and a hostile takeover. So, yeah, like what you guys are doing here is dynamite. What you guys are doing here is like is is really great stuff, and I want to be a part of it. So we have it to where Bruce doesn't want anything to do with Talbot, and so we end up having Bruce going and doing yet his second trial experiment. It seems that there were problems and issues going on with the experiment, and so we end up having Harper trying to go and figure out how to work the experiment, but eventually the experiment goes further on into a stage of which that it shouldn't. And so we end up having Bruce rushing in to try to save Harper, and it seems that Bruce throws on a gas mask for Harper, and then Betty's like, dude, you gotta get out of there. You gotta get out. Like, the gamma's gonna hit you. And so we have it to where Harper is just like bracing himself in the back corner, just thinking, like, dude, I am going to die. And so we end up having Bruce, who is trying to brace himself onto the machine to hope that he can take a brunt of the impact. And so we end up having Bruce now in the hospital, and we end up having Betty going and seeing him, basically to see that Banner is in really good health, even better than that. Like, he's more than 100%. His bad knee is now his better knee. And so we have it to where Betty is just like, dude, like, I was going to watch you die. Like, you, like, were my treasured friend, and I thought you were going to die. And Bruce is like, you know what? I'm perfectly fine. Everything's okay. It's great. Things are great. Like, so Betty ends up leaving, and then eventually we have Brian Banner come into the fray of Bruce's room and telling him, well, I'm just going to let you know that, you know what? I'm your father. Like, your name isn't Kressler, it's Banner. And so I'm your pop. And so we eventually have them reminisce about old times, because really Banner is knowing all good and well that his parents had supposedly died, both of them. And we end up having Brian mentions, like, well, that's just what General Ross wanted you to know. And really, that was all lies, and that was all distruth. And so we eventually have it to where Banner doesn't want to really hear the side of Brian, and so we eventually have it to where Banner just kind of gets very frustrated, and he mentions to Brian, it's like, well, you know what? How about you just get out? Like, I just like don't want to hear this right now. It's like, get out, and then so we end up having Brian telling him, it's like, maybe you should check that temper of yours. Maybe you should just deal with that temper. No one's gonna like you when you're angry. So we have it to where Banner goes on to get a full releasing and good in health, and so he ends up making his way back to the science lab, and so we end up having uh, Banner going and starting to get a fit of anger where he's like, "Ugh." And so we end up having Banner getting a call from Betty, and so we end up having Banner getting even more upset, and so we end up having Banner turning into the Hulk. And so we have it to where Banner is like rampaging through this science facility. We end up having Brian, who ends up uh, seeing the Hulk, and he ends up like touching the face of the Hulk, and he's like, my child, kind of thing. And so we end up having Brian end up like falling backwards, and so we end up having Bruce go and wreak havoc on this science lab, and then he ends up leaving. So we end up having Brian take some DNA samples of Banner, and he ends up going and he ends up orchestrating his own batch of Hulk dogs, let's just say. And so we have it to where Bruce ends up going and talking to Betty and like kind of talking out what happened, how eventually he had turned into something, and it kind of felt like him being birthed, and how like your heart goes boom, boom, boom. So we end up having it to where Ross is to eventually come to Banner and say, hey, like, we checked out your science lab last night and it seems like you dropped something, your entire wallet. So we have it to where Ross immediately just points the finger at Banner and says, like, yeah, like, you're the culprit of all this because you're the only one with the lost wallet in this whole entire lab. So we end up having Ross, who is to tell Banner, it's like, you will never be anywhere near my daughter, or so help me. Like, I will put you in a prison cell for the rest of your life, and so on and so forth. Like, the only thing that you're ever going to be working on is like herbal hair gel and all kinds of things. Like, how is it that you have gone and done the exact same kind of work that your father has done, and and plus also it's like you, like, I don't know how you ever recovered after like the whole incident that happened to your mother and your father, and then like Bruce is like, say what now? He's like, what, you don't remember? And he's like, no, I don't remember. And then eventually we have it to where this memory ends up being played out because eventually Betty brings Bruce back to that same location and he replays the whole thing over again. To where he doesn't want to have that door being opened. And so that eventually they end up playing out this whole thing for Bruce to remember what had happened. So So we end up finding out that it seems that Talbot is wanting a slice of the Hulk pie, let's just say, and it seems that he is trying to cut out Ross from getting any portion of the Hulk. And so we have it to where Banner ends up going home to get a call from his father to let him know, hey, yeah, like, I'm gonna go and sick my Hulk dogs on uh, on Betty. Like, you better go and save her. Like, I know they're not as good a quality as you, but you know what? They'll get the job done. And so we end up having Banner trying to run off to try and protect Betty, and Talbot ends up coincidentally arriving at the same time. To where we end up having Talbot just wanting to wrestle down Bruce to try to, I guess, eventually just say it's like, well, you're going to work for me now, or I'm going to, like, wrestle you down to the ground. And we have it to where Bruce is trying to leave because it's like, because Betty's in trouble. And so we have it to where the Talbot and Brian combination gets Banner to get really angry, and so we end up having him turning into the Hulk at his home, going and taking Talbot and just chucking him like he's a rag doll, and getting him to eventually have a neck brace and I think like a chicken wing for his trouble. So we have it to where Banner turns into the Hulk, and then he ends up jumping his way to get to Betty. So we have Betty who gets out of her cabin, her cabin. So we end up having Betty going out of her cabin to eventually find Hulk lurking in the shadows, lurking in the forest, and so we end up having the Hulk dogs making their way to Betty, and so we end up having Betty being put into her car, and so Hulk is trying to wrestle and wrangle all of these dogs, even a French poodle. Isn't that great? So we have it to where Hulk ends up taking down all of these dogs, and to where eventually after that, I guess the sun gets really low because the Hulk turns back into Banner and then ends up trying to see if Betty is okay. And so we have it to where Banner just gets a little bit frustrated that he had put Betty in so much trouble, and so he was like, ooh, and then he eventually ends up choking Betty, and so Betty ends up getting scared because Betty had this entire dream where Banner was choking her, and this is reminding her of that scene. And so, because Betty ends up telling Banner this, and Banner says, like, why did you have that dream? You know I would never hurt you. But we end up having it to where Banner is almost hurting her now. So we have it to where Banner is sleeping it off in this cabin, and Betty ends up calling Ross saying that, hey, like, Banner's here and I'm really scared because, like, this guy is just, like, he's a little unbalanced and then he's a big giant freak monster machine. So we have it to where Banner and Betty are making some kind of morning thing and morning breakfast or something. And so we end up having Banner going out of this door, kind of peeking out to see if he hears something, and he ends up getting a tranquilizer in his leg for his troubles. Betty tries to protect Banner from falling, and then we end up having Ross retrieving Banner. And so we have it to where Betty is talking to Ross at some point, and Ross is mentioning how Talbot has kind of taken control of this project and kind of stolen it away from Ross, and that Ross is really upset about it, and so on and so forth. Like, this little worm had gotten this deal, and so on and so forth. So we have it to where Talbot goes in, neck brace and all, to repetitiously just taser the Hulk continuously, or taser Banner, I mean. And so we have it to where Banner is not giving in to Talbot. He's like, dude, I have it controlled. Like, I'm not just going to be becoming the Hulk because you're tasering me a lot. And we end up having it to where Talbot is like, well, maybe I'm just going to rough you up until hopefully I can just break your neck. But we end up having Talbot just knocking Bruce out and just like saying, well, if I can't get you to do what I want you to do, which is to turn the Hulk consciously, then I will do it subconsciously. So they put Banner into a watery tank for reasons. And so we end up having them like drugging Bruce down or all kinds of things to where eventually it seems that Banner is having some nightmare. And so we end up, of course, having Banner becoming the Hulk. And immediately we have it to where the Hulk ends up breaking out of this thing of which that he is in. And so there seems to be no way for these scientists to be able to take the Hulk down or get samples from him or anything. And like, they try to slow him down, but that doesn't exactly work. So we end up having the Hulk breaking this facility, and so we have Ross who ends up getting the call, and so Ross ends up saying, well, like, turn off a good portion of the lights and help him figure out where the door is, so to speak, so we can fight him outside. Because we're not going to be able to do anything in this facility. Like, he's just going to continue to break things. So give him a doorway and let him get outside. So we end up having the Hulk getting outside, and now he is just kind of continuously jumping through these caves and mountains and whichever. And so we end up having the Hulk going, and we have Ross who has a bunch of helicopters that are trying to take down the Hulk, but that does nothing. And so eventually we get to where we have Brian Banner, who is, of course, like, if I haven't said it already, we have Nick Nolte as Brian Banner. So we have Brian who is like, you know what, like, I think it's time for me to do and repeat the experiment that is going perfectly well for Bruce. Like, I should finally release what has been within me all along. And so we end up having Banner experimenting on himself, Brian Banner experimenting on himself, and so we end up finding out that once Brian hits himself with gamma rays, we end up having Brian go and like fall off to the side, and he ends up scraping his hand. And so we end up finding out that like Brian takes the blood from his hand and he ends up like dangling it onto his hand. And so we eventually find that Brian could take his blood and put it back into his hand, and then eventually we end up seeing these like starfish looking things that appear upon his hands. Like it looks very like amphibian or whatever for his hands. So we end up having Brian seemingly put his hand through this metal piece, and it seems to have his hand is mimicking the blue of which that is to be on this metal, to where we have it to where Brian is like testing and putting his hands through the metal. So we end up finding out that Brian's power is pretty substantial, but the only thing is that Brian doesn't have the strength like Hulk does, so we end up having it to where Brian needs Hulk's strength, so he needs Hulk's power. So we end up having Brian, who is stopped by some security guard, and Brian ends up taking this security guard down with some, like him just attaching himself onto some thing, to where he ends up like smashing this security guard down. So we go on to have eventually that Banner is consistently as Hulk jumping around, to where eventually Banner realizes that immediately or Ross realizes that immediately Banner is going to head to find Betty. Like that's his only goal in life. And so we end up having Ross calling Betty saying like, well, hey, like I know that Hulk is coming for you. And so we end up eventually having Hulk making his way into town. And so we end up having Betty greeting the Hulk. And so when Betty is to walk closer and closer to the Hulk eventually starts to shrink and shrink and shrink till eventually the Hulk eventually becomes Banner yet again. So we end up having Betty and Banner go on to this facility that is kind of in the middle of nowhere. And so we end up having Banner going into a room that has his father, and so they end up like starting to talk things out. And I hope that I haven't like skipped around anything or left any big chunks of this movie out, but I also want to try to get this done as quickly as humanly possible as well. So we end up having Brian and Bruce talking it out, and it seems that Brian is like rehashing some things, talking about Bruce's mother, and Bruce is actually starting to remember some things about his mother, like a cologne that she used to wear that was actually her favorite. So we end up having Brian giving Bruce an ultimatum, basically telling him it's like, well, hey, like I have a power, it's not as substantial as yours, but if anything, I need your strength. So I need you to give me the Hulk because I need to take his power. Like, I need to take all of it. So we end up having Banner yelling at Brian to, like, go, like, just get out of here. Because I don't want to talk to you anymore. I don't want to listen to you. And so we end up having Brian saying, well, you want me to go? Like, I'll go. And so we have it to where Brian ends up consuming all of the electricity that is in this facility because Ross thinks that, oh, like, well, I can just electrify Bruce O'Brien if anything ends up going haywire, but instead that just helps give Brian more power to become this entity, to where we have Brian and Hulk fighting it out because Hulk turns into being the Hulk once this uh, thing with Brian ends up like popping off. So we end up having the Hulk fighting Brian, but it seems that Hulk is honestly in a losing battle, to where it seems that Brian is just going to keep on coming at Hulk no matter what, to eventually where we end up having Brian take Hulk into the water, and then they end up freezing the water, to where Brian is saying, like, yeah, like, keep trying, like, keep fighting me, because it'll just mean that I'll just consume more of you. And so we end up having not only Hulk but Bruce saying, like, well, take it all. And so we end up having Banner just trying to, or Hulk trying to yell into the ether of things, which is this water, which is Brian. And so we have it to where Hulk is giving Brian all of his power, to where eventually Brian is like, well, take it back, like, please, like, you're giving me way too much power. And so we end up having Brian seemingly be coming into this big giant like nuclear uh, like balloonish like thing. And so we end up having Ross sending a rocket in to just kind of nuke that environment to hopefully kill everything off. So we end up having Ross calling Betty uh, to ask if Banner has been in contact with her. And Betty says, like, well, no, like, and if he was, like, you would know, like, everything about my life is bugged, my phone's bugged, my computer's bugged, like, you would know. And so we have it to where Ross tells Betty, it's like, well, you know what, I am really and truly sorry that this has happened to you. And Betty is like, well, yeah, because I actually really did love him, and so on and so forth. So we end up knowing that Hulk is still alive, because why wouldn't he be? And so we end up finding out that Hulk is in some country somewhere in the middle of the African jungle or something like that. And so we end up having Banner seemingly being mixed up with some bandits of sorts, and it seems that they are to want something from him. And he's like, well, hey, like, don't make me angry, because you won't like me when I'm angry. And that is what to end the film with, quite possibly Banner becoming the Hulk yet again to solve his problems. So with that said, interesting movie, but then again, it's also very weird. Again, I hope I covered most of this film, because I felt like I missed out on a lot of stuff that I just kind of really quickly glanced over. There might be some important scenes that, like, oh yeah, you completely forgot about this or didn't mention that or whatever. So let me know in the comments below if there was something that I missed somewhere. Maybe there was something that was probably not important, but it is what it is. With that said, yeah, I'm gonna call this a day. Thank you for otherwise watching this review because yeah, this is an odd movie. Like honestly, this is probably the most boring Marvel movie that I've watched or I've rewatched because I realized that I'm like, man, this movie is like really boring. Because like for a Hulk movie, this should be like wall to wall like things going on, and it's not. Like it's too like I think like an hour in, like you really don't even have the Hulk in this movie, which I think is absurd. So with that said, I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.